This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 5 of Season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, January 30th, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago as we read. The first item on the January 30th issue is the Westford Center. An important real estate transfer the preceding week was the sale of the Charles H. Fletcher farm to Walter J. Merritt. This is one of the best farms in Westford. Mr. Merritt expects to take possession in the early spring. Mrs. Fletcher has reserved from the sale the lot of land west of the house. Some members of the fire company were called Monday noon to the home of Mrs. Lizzie A. Hamlin to inspect some burning soot in the kitchen chimney. Neither the firemen nor the fire did any damage. Oscar R. Spaulding lost a valuable horse from colic on Monday. The next section is the Westford Water Company. Of interest to all our residents are the doings of the Westford Water Company, the installing of whose plant has proved such a blessing to the three villages of our town the past year. The annual meeting of the stockholders was held at the residence of Julian A. Cameron, Saturday, January 23rd. According to the report of the treasurer, Charles O. Prescott, of receipts and expenditures, the finances of the company for the first year make a satisfactory showing, and this in view of two important considerations, the first being that in the installing of a plant of this kind, the expenditures for the first year are fully as extensive as planned for. Enough money has been earned to pay all expenses and interest charges. The second thing to be taken into consideration is the very serious drought of the past year, the most severe in many years, but the driven wells at Pine Ridge have stood the tax upon them, and with no diminution in the quality of the water, which, as stated before in these columns, according to the analysis of the State Board of Health, is the second best of any supply in the state. The stockholders elected the following board of directors: George T. Day, Captain Sherman H. Fletcher, and Charles O. Prescott. Mr. Prescott was elected in place of Edmund M. Blake of Boston, the former promoter and manager of the company, who has gone to Idaho, where he is interested in an irrigation company. Charles O. Prescott was elected treasurer and clerk. After the meeting was adjourned, the board of directors elected George T. Day president, Captain Sherman H. Fletcher manager of the company, with Alonzo H. Sutherland as engineer and superintendent. So he took care of the day-to-day operation of the water company. At the present time, there are 217 water takers, and more will be added to the list in the spring. The outlook for the company year is most excellent, as expenses will be reduced and the income increased. The next section is the Westford Grange. Owing to the Athletic Association dance the preceding evening, the attendance at the regular meeting of the Grange Thursday evening, January 21st, was a little less than usual, especially among the younger members. However, there was a good number of those who regularly attend. The newly installed set of officers filled the chairs with promise of good work for the year. Lecturer Edson G. Boynton distributed the new programs for the year with their cheerful red covers and well-planned possibilities within. It was annual roll call night when each member was called upon to respond with some contribution to the program, and an entertaining array of song, reading, speech, story, and instrumental music was presented, among which Mr. Taylor made a plea in defense of the deer. Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey gave some wise remarks on the sin of worry, which so affects us all. Previous to the roll call, past masters J. W. Fletcher, L. W. Wheeler, and J. P. Wright were called forward and presented with past masters' jewels. The presentation was made by Reverend B. H. Bailey with characteristic dignity and felicity. All responded appropriately. Mr. Fletcher was the first master 14 years ago, and Mr. Wheeler succeeded him. In those early days, these presentations were not customary as they became later, and it was thought best recently that all fare alike. Mr. Wheeler gave interesting reminiscences of the order in its early days, with its charter list of 40 against 200 at the present time. The next section is called Recital. A most enjoyable and successful piano and song recital was given at the home of Miss Julia H. Fletcher by her pupils last Saturday afternoon. Parents and friends of the pupils were present and enjoyed the results of the faithful instruction given to the young people by their teacher. Each pupil gave 2 solo numbers and a duet, which gave a good opportunity to show the variety of work accomplished by them. The next section is called Dance. The midwinter dance given by the Westford Athletic Association at the town hall on Wednesday evening of last week was an all-around success. The aim of this yearly concert and ball is not merely for the purpose of the money that can be realized, but for the social good time and reunion. The Salem Cadet Orchestra proved the usual potent factor contributed to the success with its good concert from 8 to 9 and the music later that the light of foot loved to dance by. A second factor was the pretty decorations. The stage was effectively draped with American flags, and the orchestra was partially screened with greenery, while the balcony and window outlines were softened with evergreen and hemlock boughs. Rugs, screens, and easy chairs transformed the stage anterooms into comfortable resting places. A third enjoyable feature was the fine turkey supper with all its accomplishments. The net proceeds were about $11 and the expenses $100. The next section is called just Institute, references to the Farmers Institute. January never furnished a better combination of weather and traveling than it did on Wednesday for a Farmers Institute at Westford, so that there was a large, perhaps record, attendance drawn by announcement of an attractive program, every item of which exceeded its promise. The extra traffic was met by more extra effort on the part of the electrics than was promised. After an address of welcome by Reverend C.P. Marshall of Westford, responded to by DeLacy Corkum of Billerica, the speaker of the day, Professor L.A. Clinton, director of Storrs Agricultural Experiment Station of Connecticut, was introduced. His morning subject was maintaining soil fertility. After dinner, Reverend B.H. Bailey was, as usual, successful as Toastmaster, calling upon ex-Senator Fred A. Patch of Littleton to speak on village improvements. DeLacy Corkum on the best use of our institutes, and C.A. Kimball of Littleton on modern educational methods as contrasted with the Little Red Schoolhouse. Professor Clinton then talked on rational use of commercial fertilizers. The next section is the About Town section. The annual turkey dinner in connection with the appraisal of the property at the town farm will be satisfactorily taken care of Saturday, February 6th. The usual will be there. No need to invite them, save your postage stamps. This was the annual dinner that the overseers of the poor had at the town farm on Town Farm Road, and the people that ran the farm always cooked a very nice dinner for the overseers, and often the selectmen and other town officials joined them. Of the 3 special jurors recently drawn from town, the names of Alfred Hartford and Amos Poley were not called, and G.A. Kimball, whose name was called, was challenged by the defense. Miss Sarah J. Taylor, who died in Lowell early Sunday morning, January 24th, was the daughter of William and Mary Exley Taylor and was born in Lowell December 22, 1841, being one of a family of 9 children. In the early spring of 1845, her father bought a farm and moved to Westford, and her early life was passed among the rural scenes of that picturesque town. She was one of the early scholars at the Little Red Schoolhouse in the palmy days of the old Stony Brook district. For the past 30 years, she has been in the employ of the C.I. Hood Company of Lowell. She leaves two brothers, Thomas E. Taylor of Woodsville, New Hampshire, and Samuel L. Taylor of Westford. And Samuel L. Taylor actually lived in his father's house that his father, William Taylor, bought at the corner of Lowell Road and Stony Brook Road. She also leaves two nephews, besides numerous relatives in this country and in Scotland. She naturally inherited a rugged constitution from her Scotch ancestry, and her sudden death from paralysis was a sad surprise to her relatives and friends. The funeral took place Tuesday afternoon from the residence of her cousin, Mrs. Helen C. Taylor in Lowell. Reverend C.P. Marshall of Westford expressed a fitting tribute for the occasion. Reverend George Tompkinson of Lowell also took part in the services. The next section is the Ford's Village section. The members of the Groton School Orchestra, under the leadership of C.S. Griswold, musical director, gave their annual concert in Recreation Hall last week, Wednesday evening. Recreation Hall was in the St. Andrew's Mission building on Pleasant Street. There was a large audience, many from out of town. After the concert, supper was served to the musicians, after which there was a social with dancing. The affair was for the benefit of St. Andrew's Mission. The proceeds were turned into the treasury of the mission. The workmen all assembled Wednesday morning to commence cutting ice on Forge Pond, but unfortunately something gave out in the boiler, and the work must be postponed until later. William Leahy has had charge of the ice houses at Forge Village for over 20 years, and also those at North Littleton, having been in charge before Miss Gage's father bought the property. I believe the boiler was used to power an engine that would lift the blocks of ice into the ice house. Samuel Blodgett underwent a serious operation at the private hospital of Dr. Kilbourne in Groton Tuesday. At time of writing, he was resting comfortably. He has been sick for many weeks, and his friends hope that he will be much better. Mrs. Chester Blodgett of the Ridges is slowly recovering from a severe attack of grippe. Miss Lizzie Ward injured her finger while attending to her work in the mill last Saturday. The next section is called Social. The Congregational Church Vestry proved a pleasant place to be on Tuesday evening when the regular monthly social was held. It was in charge of Mrs. David L. Grieg, who always plans wisely and carries out accordingly. There was a musical program which included a piano duet by Mrs. Marshall and Mrs. Boynton, soprano solo Mrs. C.D. Colburn, piano solo Hazel Hartford, and a solo by Edson G. Boynton, after which the pleasing farce How the Story Grew was given by 8 ladies. It was a convincing demonstration of the old saying that a story loses nothing in the telling, and conveyed the lesson of the necessity of accuracy in repeating statements. All sustained their parts well, and the quaint costumes were much enjoyed. The women who were in the cast were mentioned last week in the Westford Wardsman podcast. The next section is the Graniteville section. St. Catherine's Temperance Society is now progressing finely, and already they have secured a suitable building situated on 5th Street in which to hold meetings, and have had things arranged very nicely for the comfort and pleasure of its members. All the young men take a deep interest in the society, and as they are united in their efforts, they are bound to succeed. O.A. Nelson, the well-known musician of this village, has recently purchased the fast-stepping trotter Happy Jack, and intends to make the local horses, quote, go some, end quote, in order to remain in the same class with him. We'll find as we read the Wardsman that there were a small group of people who had racing horses in town, and they seemed to particularly enjoy racing them on the ice during the winter. Many people here have taken advantage of the fine sleighing during the past week. Court Graniteville Farmers of America held a largely attended meeting in its rooms on last week, Thursday evening. After the business of the meeting was dispensed with, a very enjoyable smoker was held, during which a short entertainment was given. Luncheon was then served, and a large number sat down to the well-filled tables. After the cigars were lighted and Brother Timothy Sullivan of Marlborough, who was the guest of honor and an excellent entertainer, by the way, gave several readings from the works of the late John Boyle O'Reilly and other well-known authors that were thoroughly enjoyed. Joe Hall read an original poem that made a decided hit, and James B. Healy was heard in an extract of Abraham Lincoln's famous speech on the Battle of Gettysburg. Edward Riney sang, quote, "The Low Back Car," end quote, as only Ed can sing it, and A.R. Wall gave a short talk on the principles of forestry. J.H. Payne gave a whistling solo, and Drummond's Wreck of the Julia Plant was well spoken by J.P. Leduc. This is the Wreck of the Julie Plant with plant spelled with an E at the end, by William Henry Drummond, who died in 1907, an Irish-born Montreal physician whose poems, like this one, were often written in French-Canadian dialect. That's the news in Westford for the week ending January 30th, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.